Roisin Michaux, thank you for coming on the podcast for the second time. Could you briefly introduce yourself? Is it a good idea to speak to you on matters related to gender ideology?
Hi, Paul. So thanks for having me on the show. I think it's a good idea to talk to me, I guess, because I'm an obsessive Twitter turf. I spend my whole time thinking and talking about gender identity ideology. I live in Brussels, but I'm from Ireland. I pay attention to Belgian politics, and having been involved a lot in the European institutions in the past, I kind of have a view of what's going on at a European level, Irish, Belgian. I see the similarities, the dissimilarities and things. So yeah, and I write about it on a Substack newsletter called Peaked.
I'm going to make a link to your Substack in the show notes below so that people can find you. There's been a lot going on. That's really the reason why I wanted to speak to you, because there's so much going on in this space now. As an outside observer, it looks quite positive. I'm referring, of course, to the presidential election in the US and Trump going in there and really trying to push back against the ideology. So I just wanted to ask you, do you agree that this is positive, first of all? Is what Trump is doing good? And how do you see this further evolving, this whole gender ideology landscape? Because it's very much a part of living in the Western world now. The West is much more than the US. How do you see this evolving?
Well, as a person who considers herself left-wing and progressive for my whole life, it feels very weird to say that I'm happy that Trump was elected. But I think in TERF world, TERF is an acronym that means trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is what our opponents call us. We're not trans exclusionary at all, but in terms of women's rights campaigners, everybody is very, very happy with the executive orders that Trump has announced since he was inaugurated last week. So we have two executive orders in particular. One concerns gender identity ideology, and the second one concerns gender transition for kids. Neither of them apply state by state. They're federal. They apply to federal funding, federal programs. So it means that, there's a huge source of the money and policies that was feeding this in the US has now been blocked.
But there is still a considerable number of private funding, I think, and they are quite powerful. Eh?
Yes, I think if you want to understand the subject really well, there's a really good book by Richard Hanania, who you might have seen floating around on Twitter, and it's called, his idea is basically that woke is the Civil Rights Act. A lot of what happened in the anti-discrimination law, the same applies in the EU, I think. There's a lot of anti-discrimination law that has provisions that anyone who does business with the government, for example, has to abide by certain policies, woke policies. So we're talking about Google, because Google supplies a lot of technology to the US government. So they would be under these kind of requirements to have particular anti-discrimination, DEI sort of stuff in contracts that they have with the government. So I think I think there's a lot more businesses and people who are concerned than we might think. I think the private philanthropists who fund it, that is a good question, actually. How do they compare? But yeah, I think that the federal policies and money are a huge part of it. And also the standard setting as well, I think.
You mentioned Richard Hanania, and I think he was extremely influential because I think largely due to him, this particular piece of civil rights legislation has also been rolled back by Trump in an executive order. And that's sort of taking the wind out of the sails of this entire movement. It's really quite fundamental.
And I don't know how I feel about that, honestly, because this is my main area is gender identity ideology. So we were so happy day one, we couldn't believe it. And that executive order was written by one of us. It wasn't written by Stephen Miller or Steve Bannon or whoever. It was written by a woman who understands the language was perfect.
Are you referring to the first one or the second one regarding gender affirming care? Which one are you referring to? The one that was written, you're speaking about now?
Both, actually. The first one was written by, I don't know if you know this, but the first one was written by a woman called May Mailman. And she was the lawyer for a group of women in a sorority. I think it was in some kind of red state in Wyoming, I think, who a transvestite male had joined their sorority, and they tried to get him kicked out, but the university sided with the man. And so she fought that case and she lost. And then she wrote the executive order that will lead to federal funding being cut off from a university for doing such a thing in the future. So that was a great comeback. But the second one was also written by people who were involved in detransition. So the second second executive order on gender affirming care for kids, quote unquote, because that's not really what it is, but that was also written by people who know exactly what they're talking about. They're experts in the horror that is transgender medicine and in the detransition space. So they were really written by the right people, let's say, who knew what they were talking about, who didn't make any mistakes. And I mean, opponents obviously tried to pick holes in both executive orders, but I mean, they were pristine.
How do you see this evolving? Do you think this is a fatal blow, or is this the start of a process in the US? That's the first part of the question. And secondly, if people start observing this, if this is really, this gender affirming care is really child mutilation, as it states explicitly in the executive order, if it's child mutilation in the US, it's also child mutilation in the EU. So second part of my question is, then how can this go on in the EU and the rest of the West?
I'm not an expert on American and US affairs, and we all know he's only going to be there for whatever it is, 4 years. Any government has a limited amount of time, and what's been done can be undone quite easily. It can be done on day one of the next administration. But what I think both in the US and in Europe and everywhere in the West is we're going to have what's called in sociology this preference cascade, where people are feeling more and more free to say what they really think about this stuff, because I've maintained since the beginning.
So really, free speech is making the change.
Well, I think, yes. I think that if you look at the electoral map and you see how many of your neighbors voted for Trump, despite, having so many misgivings about him as a character, you say to yourself, okay, people care about this. People care more about what he's going to do than about what he's done. And I think that that's really what's going to happen, is that more and more people are going to feel free to say, you know what, I don't think it's such a bad idea to keep males out of women's sports. And we've always been waiting for someone, we've been waiting for someone to give us permission, not me and you, obviously, but lots of people sort of need that nudge of somebody that they like and respect to sort of give them permission to say the thing that they're thinking. And the same goes for lots of things like immigration. Like if Trump were to introduce the same policies on immigration in Europe, they'd be wildly popular. About gender, they'd be wildly popular. All of these things would be wildly popular in many, many countries. It's just you're not supposed to say it. So I think in terms of J.K. Rowling, for example, she was the person who gave permission to, that's the reason why Turf Island is Turf Island, because J.K. Rowling was a very respected, progressive woman everybody loved, and she gave everyone permission to say, no, what's happening is not okay. And I'm not saying that Trump is that kind of character, but I think the redness of the map shows people that, okay, these are things that I was thinking too. Even the New York Times, they have a daily podcast called The Daily, and a few days before the election, one of their journalists said, and he snuck it in 3/4 of the way through the episode. It wasn't top of the hour, but he said the men and the males in women's sports really is an issue that people care about. Yes. So I think it was a much bigger issue than anyone is ready to admit. And I think that it's the exact same here. I think it's a huge issue here. And the only people who will say to me, oh, it's a non-issue, that's only a niche thing that you care about, is newspaper editors, because they don't want to admit. They know that it's a huge thing, and they want to make you feel small and bad about bringing it up. So when you say to them, children are being mutilated in Europe, they'll say, this is a weird little obsession that you and some freaks on the internet have. They know that's not true.
Where do you see this going, by the way? Because you mentioned the New York Times, but I read 2 days ago, there was even the chief editor of Politico was admitting that Trump is, let's say, almost a historic figure now, because of the way he came to power, because of the obstacles that he had to surmount, because of the attempt on his life, and because of his obvious and very clear love for his country. Even Politico now admits that Trump is sort of kind of a force of nature. So what I mean to say is that even the mainstream media seem to be taking a different tack.
Yeah.
And then on top of this, you have this general, let's say, loss of authority, loss of power of the mainstream media compared to the alternative media, the podcasters. This really was, I think, the election where podcasters like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, and all the other ones, their power greatly increased. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the last time that the election in 2020, was it 2020? That was the last time that the media had any real real power over anything or anyone. That will be the last one. That's all. Those days are over. The traditional media is finished. I don't know what's going to replace it. And I think what's going to replace it is going to be ugly. And I don't think it's going to be paradise from now on. But the mainstream media is finished. You know, I think there's an internal struggle in the New York Times. They're all schizophrenic in a way, because it's the same with a hospital. It's the same at a school. It's the same anywhere. You've got some people who are true believers, are diehard wokeists, and then you've got the rest of them who are trying to fight back. It's an internal struggle in every single institution. So, you know, if the New York Times wants to maintain some of some of the respect of people, which you will love, it would be great to have an outlet that you can trust. They're going to have to bring some balance back. And as you say, Trump is a force of nature. Everyone wanted him, like not everyone, sorry, but the majority wanted him. You know, if there that's clearly they wanted him. Yes. That's like, it doesn't even really matter. Like, he has nothing else really matters. He has a mandate. Yes. And he was democratically elected. And what really disgusts me now is talk of him being a threat to democracy. He's there because of democracy. Yeah. People wanted him. And I think the huge difference now is that people are so much more resigned than they were in the last time round. You know, I listened to Politico Europe podcast this morning talking about his ambassador picks for Europe. And some of them actually really, the ambassador to the EU, it kind of reassured me, because he's a businessman and the Americans don't want to destroy their market. You know, the EU is a huge market, so they're not going to nuke, you know, the EU. He does have a dodgy background and seems to have been accused of some nasty stuff. So there's obviously some unsavory characters, but that's who the Americans chose, and that's who we have to deal with. And I think that resignation is reflected in how Ursula von der Leyen is reacting. But yeah, the Politico episode this morning, they were still trying to trash him in the same way that they did all those years ago. And I just thought, did you not get the memo? Those days are over. You can't, you know, it's a little bit like trying to concoct this drama over Elon Musk's Nazi salute. I mean, do they really think they have the power anymore to create something like that and to make it stay in the headlines for days? They just don't anymore, you know. Yeah,
it's not something that is exclusive to the media. We see that the people in power in general, they are trying to push back by doubling down. You see that with the DSA, you see it with the media, you know, always resorting to this very tired and often debunked strategy. But is it also the case with, I really wanted to talk to you about this gender ideology. It's so important. It's our children's future. It's about education. It's about the brainwashing going on in schools. It's much larger than this, than child mutilation and this gender affirming care. It's the whole process that goes before it, where children are really brainwashed into thinking that they might be another gender, where they're maybe just, you know, slightly autistic or gay. This needs to stop. So do you see any signs at all of the let's say, the EU changing course, or is this lobby simply too powerful?
The thing that needs to change is that the money needs to be cut off. That's, I mean, after all these years of researching
the subsidies
need to be cut off. And I think just to bring it to Belgium for a moment, I wrote about this a couple of months ago. If you could see the number of NGOs and the amount of money that they receive, and these people are sitting around, they've got, in Belgium, can you imagine, there's no country more progressive than Belgium. They have gay rights.
Yeah, you keep saying that. People don't realize it, that Belgium is really at the forefront, the vanguard of this whole gender movement. You really explained that very well in our previous podcast. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes below. But could you summarize that briefly? How is it that Belgium is really number one for gender insanity?
I think that each country in the EU sort of, you sort of have your brand, don't you? Like Ireland's brand is sort of the goodest boy, like the one who does all of the things, does all of the you know, because we're dependent on the bigger countries. We don't have that much power. And Belgium is one of these countries that said, you know what, our brand is being the most progressive. This has just been Belgium's brand. And I'm talking about at an supranational level in the UN and stuff. Belgium has always been the most reliably advanced advanced. I think it's regressive in many ways, but
Yes.
for example, the Evras, I don't know what you call it in Flanders, actually. I was trying to figure out the other day, but in Wallonia, the Evras in Flanders, what's it called?
Let's say the counterpart would be Savaria, which is heavily subsidized by the
Savaria.
Flemish government.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's an NGO, isn't it? It's not like the...
well, it's a VZW, but they're all dependent on government subsidies. If you take away this faucet of money, things stop.
That's the solution. It really is the solution, and I think a really good a demonstration of how that would work was illustrated this week in France. Did you see the story about the guy who went to a gynecologist in France, and he tried to be treated for a gynecological complaint, for a woman's complaint, even though he was a male? And so he went to this gynecologist with his friend, who as an adult brings their friend to the doctor, I don't know, but that will become relevant in a minute. He went to the doctor with his friend. He was told by the secretary that this gynecologist doesn't treat males because he specialized in female reproductive systems. So you have no business being here, go away. And immediately a Google review popped up on the doctor's website, on the doctor's listing on Google, complaining that the doctor was transphobic. The guy goes to the gynecologist with his friend, comes out, they do a Google review saying the most transphobic guy ever, whatever, defames the doctor. And then suddenly there's a complaint launched to the medical board, the Ordre de Médecins, which is the order of doctors in the region.
Which makes it very serious,
Makes it very serious. Plus a complaint to the discrimination body for hate speech, another very serious thing.
Which makes it criminal.
Makes it criminal. It's a criminal complaint. Those two guys, it turns out, one of them at least was found to be working for the NGO that did all the reporting.
Yes.
And the other one, it seems, was also attached to the NGO in some capacity. So it certainly looks to me like they were fishing for transphobia. And that's not the first time that's happened.
Fishing for intimidation because they want to make an example. They want to heavily publicize it. And then by publishing such an outrageous case, they want to intimidate the whole field into submission.
Yeah, a kind of an extremist case. Yeah,
yes.
Like a sort of, the more extreme, the better. To sort of, utter intimidation. But what happened is that has happened many times that I've come across. These organizations, they make claims about how bad the situation is, the severity of the transphobia, the hatred, the homophobia, in order to get the grants. And then they get the subsidies and they've got their Canva account and their nice new laptops and their little office space. And what do? They need to find evidence that what they claimed was happening is happening. So I think these two guys, they picked a random gynecologist off a doctor.
They go fishing.
And they went fishing. And this happened in Malta. This is extreme. So you've got all these conversion therapy laws being percolating all over Europe the last few years. It was enacted in Malta. The first case for conversion therapy in Malta, and potentially even anywhere in the EU, was a guy who went on a YouTube channel to say that he had prayed away the gay himself. So he comes on a YouTube channel and speaks about his own experience of being an ex-gay, and that you can do it too if you want. If you don't like being gay, you can do it. The guy who works for ILGA, who was previously in the cabinet of Helena Dali, launches a complaint against this guy for promoting conversion therapy. He was only talking about his own experience, and the guy was convicted of it. So it's all fishing for cases to demonstrate a problem exists after the fact. Disgraceful. But the thing is, of those two guys in France, if they had no money, they'd be doing something else. They'd have a salary. They wouldn't be doing that on a volunteer basis. They
Absolutely.
would, if there was no organization. If there was no organization to volunteer with or to work for or whatever, they'd be off doing something else. So the money needs to stop. And so I think what we're in right now is like a round of funding that began ages ago, but it's kind of a critical juncture.
Could you elaborate a little on that? Because they do not simply have money. They are swimming in subsidies and cash. This is one of the most powerful lobbies, I think, that is active in Europe at this moment. People underestimate how powerful this lobby is. Could you maybe elaborate a little on that? Or
Yeah, I mean, in Belgium, I did an article a while ago about the drama around the Grand Cactus TV show. There was an episode of the Grand Cactus that took the piss out of transgender people, and it was a very mild joke, but all of the associations like descended on RTBF, which is the Francophone broadcaster. And so it was just such a shocking just volume of people who maneuvered to attack RTBF. And so I sort of traced it, and I realized that it was all very coordinated with a lot of the drag queens who work for the Drag Queen Race, whatever, Belgium TV show, but then all the associations. And so I saw this list of associations, there's been 30 or 40 of them, and they're all receiving subsidies. And then they all have umbrella organizations who are receiving millions in subsidies, and they're all getting $1 million each, and there's 10 of them, and then they're re-granting to smaller organizations. And then in Flanders is another story, and in Brussels is another story. So you've got the 3 regions, probably the 4, all giving millions and millions. And what do they do with this money? Because there's gay marriages there, self-ID, all of these things that you could possibly want. And so coming back to what you're talking about, the indoctrination of children, the really worrying thing about this is they use that money to create programs to go into schools and to teach, to indoctrinate children. And this is, if you go to any of the NGOs, like Rainbow House is the umbrella for the Brussels NGOs. Go in there. Fédération Prisme is the one in Wallonia, and it's probably Cavaria or Savaria in Flanders.
It is.
They'll be the umbrella, and then they have all these other smaller ones. So when you go onto the Everest website and you want to find out who can give me an Everest course or who can give my school an Everest course, a lot of them are the Centre de Planning Familial, the family planning centers, which are all completely ideologically captured, by the way.
They are actually the opposite of family planning. They are the family destruction centers.
Yeah, that's it. They're abortion.
So there's also this language which is constantly misleading. People don't know what they're talking about anymore, because they hide behind language which is clearly the opposite of what they're doing.
It's true. I thought you were going to say something about abortion, but it's true. They don't want anyone to construct a family. They want to destroy this middle class idea of the family and have everyone polyamorous and fucking around. And as long as you're on the right drugs, then it's all good. But the thing is that all those people who are running those organizations, they all come from nice homes, and they'll all end up getting married and moving on when they finish their radical phase. You know, this is what really pisses me off about them. Luxury beliefs. And that's what they are like. Yeah. But so when you look at the Everest webpage, you can see that half the people given the indoctrination classes are the family planning, and the rest of the NGOs. And these NGOs are bananas. Like they believe the craziest things. And it's always like they always sink to whoever the craziest member of staff is, that's the level. Because you can't contradict, the crazy, obese, green-haired, NB, neurodivergent intern. You have to say, okay, we're all, we all agree with you, because you don't want to upset them. So everyone ends up coming to this crazy level. There's no adult in the room anymore, and these people are dictating so much about what goes in. Like, look, if it weren't for those organizations, the Everest curriculum wouldn't be what it is. So the money needs to be cut off.
Why do all these mainstream parties, even so-called mainstream parties on the right or of the right, parties that have been traditionally Christians, like CD&V in Belgium, like N-VA, they are on paper, they are conservative, but they just toe the line. They just go along with this insanity. On paper, they are against it, but once they come to power, it seems that subscribing to this ideology is actually a precondition of ascending to power.
Yeah, it's a really good question. One partial answer is that a lot of these things are already en route when they get in. So we can be charitable and say, like, a lot of it has taken years to get to a point to, and then also a lot of funding programs. Like if you give NGO or a strategy or a program 5 years, a political party is likely to come in when that funding is already underway and your department's already working on it. But another reason is because people like, Boris Johnson, even, who's conservative, like he has his friends in the UN. He wants to do, like, the UN, when it comes to comprehensive sexuality education, the Everest stuff, that's very much a UN-driven thing. And there are a lot of agreements, and there's a whole level of government above us.
Is that because of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals?
It started before that. It was millennial development goals, then sustainable development goals. But yeah, I mean, you can see now, I think to answer in the briefest way possible, all those people, all those parties are catching up now. They're seeing the damage that's done, and hopefully they're going to see that all we have to do is not sign on the next project grant funding or operational grants, and then a lot of this is going to go away, because there won't be anyone going to Geneva to lobby the UN for the UN to tell you what to do. But on an international level, gender identity in a development level, UN level, above the EU, but on the global level, gender identity ideology is huge. And it's huge because, and this is my theory, what's gay in our society is gender identity in most of the poor world, because you can't be a gay man in Thailand, or you can't be a gay man in most of the world.
In other cultures, it's still more of a taboo.
Yeah, you could, but you can pretend to be a woman. So if we're to have a global, globally,
it's the same in the Islamic world. In Iran, for example, they'd rather trans you than accept that you're gay.
Yeah. So, I mean, they think that this is a European invention as a gay man. They say, no, but we let, feminine men, they tend to work in prostitution, and we pretend they're women, and that's our arrangement. And so on a global level, if you want to fix HIV and a lot of poverty problems, you need to accept that the teen must go in with the LGB. Like this is, and I think that this is why conservative governments who
never thought about that. Yeah. Exactly.
I think that's what's going on.
It's an important point. Absolutely. Yeah.
You have to include the T if you want to cover all the gays, if you're working on a global level. And that's what the WHO does, and that's what the UN does, and that's what UNESCO does, that's what UN Women does. That's why they're all so captured. It's not just because they've got green-haired non-binaries in their office. It's also that. It's because there is an issue with the universality of gay. And we are, and one of the SDGs, the most important, is HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. Yeah. So there's a lot of money in these programs, and there's a huge diplomatic effort to gay the world, and it's not because people want gay people to be happy. It's not because conservative governments in power want gay people to be happy and have parades and live a nice long living life. It's because of HIV. So we have a lot of money going into programs. To demonstrate how important it is, Trump is keeping on the PEPFAR program, as far as I understand. So he was going to cut all of these programs, and then the problem of HIV in Africa is so profound, and consecutive conservative governments in the US for decades have been re-signing the agreements every time, because it's so important. So this is a big global priority. And I think that explains a little bit why the T is added to the LGB at that supranational level, and why it's so important to keep it there. But again, I've said this to you before, and you probably agree, I don't care what any adult does with their body. What matters is that the T changes the meanings of words, it changes the laws, and it changes what happens to our children. So, if we take all that out, too much respect has been afforded to these NGOs. Too much authority has been given to these NGOs.
The problem is that these NGOs are non-governmental by definition, but they are governmental in practice. It's a front for the government, because they operate 100% on tax money. So that makes them the opposite of an NGO.
We're in a crucial moment. Because, the public perception of an NGO is that they represent civil society, which means the people. They don't represent the people. And when it comes to the EU level in particular, the EU treats NGOs as people that will advise them on making laws and policies, because the Commission doesn't have all the... This is normal. It's kind of a surprise to some people, but it's normal. The government doesn't have the expertise in-house. So they ask civil society to come and tell them. But the problem is to tell them what's a priority, what's important, what does your community need? And that's completely normal. So they have that for every sort of different issue. You wouldn't want to make an educational policy without speaking to some teachers, would you? And the teachers aren't going to come to you individually and knock on your door. What they're going to do is organize into an organization, and then come and send a representative to the stakeholder meeting. That's
how it works.
And this is how it works. But what's happened is that ILGA Europe, which is the biggest NGO representing gay, lesbian, trans, queer, intersex rights, they are getting now more than 2 million per year from the Commission. and it's very difficult to separate them now.
I thought it would be more, because I think if you compare that to what the Savaria is getting in Flanders, it's huge. Huh? The amount of subsidies that these people are getting, it's absolutely
that's just
huge.
for ILGA Europe. That's not counting all the 1,000 other NGOs, rainbow NGOs.
Yeah, they are swimming in cash. Are you optimistic now? More optimistic, because it's sort of felt like the previous years, like the train was really hurtling toward the ravine or hurtling toward the wall, and I have a feeling that now, you said that, okay, Trump is only going to be there for 4 years. But to me, and I think to a lot of commentary that I read, it feels like a culture shift. It feels like much more than there's another president, he'll be gone in 4 years. It feels like the culture is shifting, because there's quite a high chance that J.D. Vance will probably continue the legacy. They're on the same page. He's very young. So we might be, a lot of commentary says we're off for 12 years of MAGA now. So how do you see this?
Yeah, in general, I'm very hopeful. And the reason is because the pendulum has swung so far in one direction. We need some balance. And, if our institutions had allowed for conservative points of view in these past decades, we wouldn't be where we are now. So if whatever happens to the things that I care about dearly, like abortion access and gay rights and things, if any of those things are interfered with by radical fundamentalists in the Trump administration, I blame the extremist leftists for that. It's not, we can never be in a situation ever again where we have such lopsided representation of one ideology. It's never going to work. It's always going to create such a backlash.
Yeah. It all starts with free speech and maintaining free speech. I want to hear, I probably have not the same views as you have on abortion, which doesn't mean they're contrary, but they're probably slightly nuanced, slightly different. But we need to have these conversations. I really want to hear what you think and why you think it. And probably it might be interesting to have this clash of ideas. And that's been,
it's very useful. It's very useful. And it's also, you can't say, like, if 50% of my country believe like you do, I'm not just going to call you a Nazi and cut you off,
Yeah, the level of the discourse has been really appalling.
And it really is. It's sort of like progressives are acting like what I think and feel is the air we breathe. And anyone who strays from that is beyond the bounds.
Is a Nazi,
deplorable Nazi fascist. We can't do that. And I think when you see these women's speaking events, the Let Women Speak events that are hosted by Kelly J. Keane, which you might know, I don't know if you've noticed, but the whole point of those events is for the activists to shout so loudly that nobody can hear what we're saying. And I think what Trump has done is he's broken the seal, and people are going to be able to talk about the issues, whether in a way I like or in a way I don't like, but now the conversation can be had about gender identity, gender affirming care in a way that he's broken the seal. He's given loads of people permission to speak about these things. And I think come back in 12 months' time, I think that a lot of people who pretended they didn't know what was going on are going to suddenly be very aware of what was going on, and they're going to have opinions on it. And I think that's going to change everything. And so in that way, I'm not a MAGA fan, but I'm very, very hopeful that this rebalancing is gonna help out our society in general. And as you say, free speech, the big thing now obviously is the DSA and Twitter's ability to stay a free speech platform in Europe. I think that the Commission would make a very, very big mistake if they didn't allow at least one place where we can say what we want, because the other side have everything,
They have everything, but I think J.D. Vance already made it quite clear during the campaign that if the American platforms are attacked on the free speech side, that this would have consequences for NATO and tariffs, etc., etc. So I don't think Trump will take any kind of censorship lightly. At least I think they will demand for the platforms to stay open. If not, we are really in a bad space.
But I think the Commission did a very clever thing in saying, okay, we won't define what hate speech is. We leave that up to the Irish government, to the Belgian government, to the Dutch government. So what's going to happen is, if I say something transphobic, the Belgian government can say, okay, we're going to take that off the platform because that's sorry, the Belgian government will block my tweets. They will report my tweets, or their trusted flaggers will report my tweets. And then it's up to the platform to remove my tweets or else risk a huge fine. So it will be Twitter itself that does the censorship as a preventative of losing a lot of money.
I know how it works,
so,
but I don't think Trump will ever accept that his new big tech friends will be fined billions by the EU.
Okay.
I don't think that's going to happen.
You think that's the part that's not going to happen?
He will not allow it, I think. And if he does, then we are really in a bad place.
Yeah.
We really have to count on the Americans, unfortunately, to keep our free speech space open.
And I'm really happy that it could. I wish it had happened in a different way, but I'm really glad that he got in and he just wiped the slate clean. Like, it can only bring good things, I think, in terms of gender identity and wokeness, DEI, and the rest we'll have to see.
Absolutely. Roisin Michaux, thank you very much for your time and for your comments. Where can people find you online?
There are two places. I'm on Twitter as Roisin Michaux, and I am on Substack. My Substack is called Peaked, Peaked, as in peaked to the trans madness.
Peaked Substack. I will put 2 links in the show notes below. Roisin Michaux, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.